Valentine's Day had been perfect. The city lights danced through frost-touched windows as Nick and I held hands at the cozy party, of laughter and love songs wrapping around us like a warm blanket. 2 years together, and every moment with him still felt like magic. But as we drove away from the glow of the city toward the secluded cottage we had rented for the week, the magic began to twist into something much darker. The road narrowed as we left the main highway, gravel crunching beneath the tires as we ventured onto a winding, unpaved path. Towering trees arched above us, their gnarled branches entwining like skeletal fingers, blotting out the moonlight. The night was black and heavy, the air so cold I could see my breath misting the window. Nick's hands were tight on the steering wheel, his face set with concentration as the car jolted over uneven ground. The only sound was the low hum of the engine, swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence that pressed in on us. It felt wrong, too still, too empty. I tried to shake the unease gnawing at me, but then I saw him, a man on a bicycle. He was just there, suddenly illuminated by our headlights, riding slowly in the middle of the road. His back was rigid, his movements mechanical as his legs turned the pedals with a precise, unnatural rhythm. He wore a long, tattered coat that flapped like broken wings, and a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face in shadow. The bicycle was ancient, its metal frame rusted and warped, creaking with every turn of the wheels. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Should we pass him?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Nick's jaw tightened. "It's too narrow. We'll just follow until he turns off." But he didn't. We crawled behind him, the car inching forward at his agonizingly slow pace. He never looked back, never wavered, just kept pedaling steadily, the wheels grinding on the gravel. It was as if he didn't see us or didn't care. My pulse quickened, anxiety tightening in my chest. The road seemed endless, winding deeper into the black forest. Then, without warning, the man turned sharply into the trees. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, swallowed by the shadows. Nick let out a breath, shaking his head. That was weird. He pressed the gas, eager to leave the encounter behind. But the feeling of unease clung to me, growing stronger as the road grew rougher. The headlights flickered, the engine grumbled, the branches overhead groaned, bending low as if trying to reach us. My eyes flicked to the side mirror, heart skipping a beat as I thought I saw movement, a shape flitting through the darkness, keeping pace with us. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Nick glanced at me. "See what?" I opened my mouth to answer, but then the cottage appeared ahead, its small silhouette nestled at the edge of the woods. Relief flooded me, though I couldn't explain why. We pulled into the clearing, the car's headlights illuminating the front yard, and that's when I saw it, the bicycle. It lay on its side by the porch steps, its frame twisted and rusted, one wheel still slowly spinning. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Nick, that's the same bike. It's his bike." Nick frowned. "No, it can't be." We left him back on the road, but his voice wavered, his eyes fixed on the bent metal. "Maybe someone else lives nearby?" "There's no one for miles," I whispered. A cold wind swept through the clearing, rattling the windows of the cottage. The shadows seemed to stretch, growing longer, darker. I grabbed Nick's arm. "Let's just go inside. I don't want to stay out here." We hurried up the steps, the old wood creaking beneath our feet. Nick unlocked the door, and we stepped into the warmth of the cottage, locking the door firmly behind us. But the warmth did nothing to ease the icy knot of fear in my chest. We stood in silence, the faint hum of the heater the only sound. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp knocks, slow and deliberate, echoing from the front door. My heart seized, and I gripped Nick's arm. He shook his head, his face pale. "Don't open it." The knocking came again, harder this time. The door shook on its hinges, then silence. Heavy, suffocating silence, until the footsteps began. They circled the house, crunching over fallen leaves and frost-bitten grass. Slow, methodical, around and around, over and over, dragging footsteps that never wavered, never hurried. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands to my ears, but the sound only grew louder. Then, without warning, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed us, thick and complete. Nick fumbled for his phone, the screen's pale glow flickering to life. His face was ghostly in the dim light, eyes wide with fear. "We need to check the back door. I locked it, I think." Together we moved down the hallway, the phone's weak beam trembling as Nick's hands shook. The air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to ripple along the walls. We reached the back door, and my stomach dropped. It was ajar, a faint draft whispering through the gap. Nick's voice was hollow. "I know I locked it." The phone's light fell on the floor, illuminating muddy footprints leading from the door, trailing into the darkness of the house. The prints were uneven, smudged, as if whoever left them had been dragging one foot. A shuffling sound came from the living room. Nick grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the front door. But before we could reach it, the knocking resumed. Loud, insistent, the wood vibrating with each blow, and then from behind us came the creaking, a slow rhythmic creak, like rusted metal grinding, like wheels turning. I turned, my heart freezing in my chest. The shadows in the living room shifted, revealing a hunched figure. The man stood over his bicycle, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, wide-brimmed hat hiding his face. The wheels spun slowly, squeaking with each turn. He took a step forward, dragging one foot, mud dripping from his boots onto the wooden floor. The knocking at the front door grew more frantic, and then the handle began to turn. We were trapped. The man took another step, and his head snapped up, revealing a face contorted in a grotesque grin, hollow eyes gleaming with cold, malevolent light. His mouth moved, whispering words that sounded like the rustling of dead leaves. "You shouldn't have followed." The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty. The footprints were gone, the bicycle was gone. The door was locked, just as Nick had left it, but the cold lingered, and in the distance somewhere deep within the woods, I heard the faint, echoing creak of wheels turning. Somewhere out there he was still riding, waiting for the next car to follow him down that dark, endless road. The wrong turn on Shadow Street! The day after Valentine's was bleak, a sharp contrast to the warmth of red roses and chocolate hearts that had flooded the world just hours before. The air was heavy, stale, as if even the remnants of love had died. I was driving home after visiting an old friend in a nearby town, relying on my unreliable GPS that flickered and stuttered, its screen spasming like something possessed. When it finally went dark, I cursed under my breath, deciding to trust my own sense of direction, a mistake I'd regret for the rest of my life. I was passing through a forgotten city, a place neglected by time and memory. It was a hollow shell, crumbling brick buildings leaning in as if whispering secrets to one another. The streetlights above were dim, sputtering with a sickly yellow glow that buzzed like a swarm of dying insects. Shadows loomed everywhere, long and warped, stretching over the cracked pavement like skeletal fingers. A bitter wind hissed through the alleyways, carrying with it a scent of rot and decay. I made a turn, a wrong turn. I can't remember if I was distracted or if something compelled me, but the moment my tires rolled onto that narrow street, an icy chill ran down my spine. Everything changed. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and the light seemed to bleed out of the world. Darkness pooled between the buildings, an inky blackness that swallowed everything it touched. The road was narrow, flanked by ancient structures whose windows gaped like hollow eyes. Their facades were shattered, crumbling, their wooden boards creaking as if whispering warnings too faint to hear. The streetlights were dead here, their glass shattered, leaving only darkness that seemed to writhe and twist. I tried to turn back, but the street had changed behind me, stretching into an endless tunnel of shadows. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized my phone was dead. The GPS on the dashboard was just a blank screen, its light extinguished. It was as if the shadows had drained the power from everything, leaving me stranded in their suffocating grasp. That's when I saw them. At first, they were just shapes in the darkness, silhouettes standing unnaturally still. I squinted, trying to make sense of them. People, maybe? But as I drove closer, my blood ran cold. They weren't standing. They were floating, hovering inches above the ground. Their forms were jagged, shifting, their edges dissolving like smoke caught in a breeze. They were human-shaped but wrong, twisted, elongated, limbs bending in impossible directions as they swayed, their movements grotesque and alien. Their faces were hollow voids, eyeless and featureless, yet I could feel their gaze. It was like a weight pressing down on me, piercing through the glass and skin and bone. I couldn't breathe. Their heads moved in unison, tilting slowly, curiously, as if studying me. I heard whispers, faint and disjointed, echoing from the shadows, voices speaking in tongues that twisted my stomach into knots. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched, the engine roared, but the street stretched on, an endless corridor of darkness. The figures didn't chase me. They simply watched, their heads swiveling as I passed, their bodies swaying like corpses on strings. But in the rearview mirror, I saw them move. They didn't run. They flowed, melting into the shadows and reappearing closer, always closer, their hollow faces fixed on me. Their limbs snapped and twisted as they moved, joints cracking, bones breaking, yet they never faltered, never slowed. They were toying with me, letting me think I had a chance. The street began to narrow, the buildings leaning in, their crumbling walls curving inward as if trying to swallow me. My chest tightened, my lungs fighting for air. I could hear them now, the sound of their limbs scraping against the pavement, their whispers growing louder, hungrier. I felt something cold brush against the car, a shadowy hand sliding across the window, its fingers impossibly long and thin, nails scraping like claws against the glass. I didn't dare look, my eyes glued to the road that refused to end. The whispers grew frantic, excited, overlapping in a cacophony of madness. Then the road opened up, spilling into a vast empty square. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. My chest heaved, vision swimming as I tried to catch my breath. The figures stopped at the edge of the square, their shapes flickering like candle flames. They didn't cross into the open space, their hollow faces turning upward toward the center. An ancient tree stood there, enormous and twisted, its branches gnarled and reaching like skeletal arms. The bark was black, cracked and bleeding a thick, tar-like sap that dripped onto the ground. Hanging from its limbs were bodies, countless bodies, swaying gently, their faces hidden by shadows. They weren't human. Their limbs were too long, their torsos stretched, necks crooked at impossible angles. They wore nooses made of shadow, their heads lolling as if asleep. But they were watching me. Their eyes opened, glowing faintly with a sickly white light that pierced through the darkness. Their mouths stretched wide, too wide, splitting their faces in grotesque grins that revealed rows of needle-thin teeth. They began to whisper, their voices merging with those of the shadowy figures, a chorus of hatred and hunger. The branches creaked, the bodies twitched, their limbs jerking to life. They began to sway, then dance, their forms contorting as they writhed, the ropes snapping as they dropped to the ground, their bodies bending and snapping, moving like broken marionettes. They crawled toward me, limbs cracking, faces twisted with glee, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I screamed. I don't remember how I got out. I don't remember the drive home. One moment I was staring at those things crawling closer, their whispers filling my head, and the next I was on the highway, the city a distant silhouette behind me. My phone buzzed to life, GPS recalculating as if nothing had happened. I never spoke of it. Who would believe me? But every night as I lie awake in the dark, I hear them. The whispers scratching at the windows, the shadows dancing just beyond the light. And when I close my eyes, I see them waiting beneath that ancient tree. Their hollow eyes watching, their mouths grinning, waiting for me to take another wrong turn. They're waiting, and they're hungry.